today we have a Q&A session with Dan, and it's going to be on brand tracking. It's something that I really struggled with in my early career when trying to justify budgets to my boss. And so I know there's going to be lots of marketers out there today. It's a problem, a lifelong problem for marketers, but wanting to know more about how you can prove the value of spending on brand marketing. Our guest Dan knows all about this. Our Dan, he's the country manager of Tracksuit, and has an interesting story, which I'll let him tell you, of someone who went from working at a VC firm and questioning where and why so much money was being spent on brand to realizing it was a super important thing to do. You can follow Dan by scanning that code here. He talks about brand marketing, and if you want to know more, you can do that. Today, this link that you've got here will take you to a page that is all about apprenticeships. So if you're looking for a marketing or sustainability role or somebody in the PR team, hiring an apprentice can be easier than you think. And Cambridge Marketing College are spreading the word about government funding and helping businesses train apprentices. We also have other partners, Sticky Beak, Planable, Redgate, and Frontify, who we talk about on rotation. But we're all grateful, very, very grateful for all of those folks who are allow these sessions to happen for free for you, which is really cool. So, Dan, great to have you here. I wonder whether, as a way of sort of kicking off the session, to give people a sense of your journey, could you tell us a little bit about your sort of history in terms of brand marketing and what your role is now at Tracksuit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, James. And I'm going to take our Dan as a little bit of a nod to
I
potentially picking up a British twang. I don't know. Am I getting
think
it, or
that's your new,
Australianisms coming through still?
yeah, it's your new name, Dan.
No, stoked to be here. So thank you so much for having me on. I mean, in terms of my journey, you touched on it there. So I, from Sydney, worked in a lot of early stage software companies before making the dreaded jump to the finance world on the venture capital side, investing in software and consumer brands, and spent a lot of the time, especially over the COVID era, helping our brands think about how do they drive towards profitability. And part of that was assessing budgets, thinking about growth, thinking about fortifying performance in the next 12 months. Where is the survival window? And pretty quickly started cutting brand budgets like no tomorrow, and just really not understanding how you could quantify what this spend was going to. And yeah, a few months, years went on. I received an investment memo from the Tracksuit team about, hey, we can actually do this in a cost-effective way. Um, and it jumped across my desk. It was a Friday morning, and I was like, what the hell? Like, this is something that all our portfolio companies are struggling to do. Anyway, dove into it, met the Tracksuit team, absolutely fell into brand tracking and how you can start to really tell the story of brand and performance and the importance of brand in extending that performance window. And so, yeah, jumped over to the Tracksuit team, made the jump to London, have been here for now coming on 3 years, and absolutely loving every moment of it.
That's wicked. Thanks, Dan. And you brought the sunshine today.
Yeah.
You brought the proper Sydney vibes, which is awesome. I forgot to say, folks, if you I've got a bunch of questions that I'm going to go through with Dan initially. So we're going to start with understanding brand impacts. I'm going to then move on to communicating the value of brand internally to your teams. Then we'll go on to measurement, tactics, and tools. And then finally, we're going to talk about sort of long-term versus short-term thinking. If throughout this session you have questions, if you look at the bottom, you'll see the Q&A section. If you add questions into the Q&A, then I'll make sure that we get the most upvoted ones answered in the sort of second half of this session. So carry on in the chat, but make sure your questions end up in the Q&A. So if we could start with if you think about the current landscape on brand marketing, it can feel a bit high level sometimes. And so, what do you, in terms of a definition, what do you hear as the most sort of common understanding of what brand marketing means these days to folks?
Common understanding is tough, but I like to believe that most people think of brand through the lens of perception. So, how do you influence how people think and feel about a brand? And the other way to look at it is what's the counter? So, what's the common misunderstanding? And I think that is from my old world of essentially looking at brand as a siloed activity that only marketing are responsible for. Bit of fluff, logos, lots of creativity, and a bit nice to have. And so I think the common understanding that's really starting to move in the space is that it is a shared responsibility. And at least the way that we think about it internally is how does brand touch every customer touch point along all functions? So how does your sales team show up? How does your customer success team show up? And then absolutely, how does your advertising show up? And um, you build brilliant campaigns. Like I feel like airlines always get brought into this conversation. So someone like the likes of British Airways, where last year they ran the campaign run by Uncommon, which was that phenomenal out of home where it had the window and it made you just like dive into the emotional connection to travel. And then you can roll into the airport and have an awful check-in experience, or your seat on the plane is dirty, or whatever it might be. And so I think that common understanding of brand being shared across the organization and understanding that it is every touch point that a customer has with that brand, and how do you influence how they think and feel about you outside of just advertising.
Yeah, I guess there's brand tracking, which you guys are experts in. There's brand management, which is that every single touch point, and quite often I think brand marketing is part of it, isn't it? It's not just the marketing part. It's the brand is tracked in more ways than just marketing or advertising, which
Yeah,
is really interesting.
absolutely. And I mean, on the measurement side, it's then how do you leverage that data to say, is this a marketing issue? Is this an operational issue? Coming back to the point on the customer experience at check-in, is this actually how we're showing up in the operations side versus just how people are thinking or perceiving our brand from the campaigns that we're running?
Yeah, because you could be a brilliant marketer, but if you've got you know somebody on the check-in desk who's miserable and people are having a bad experience and sales are dropping because of that, then it's very difficult to sort of
Yeah.
point the finger. So what sort of metrics do you see most commonly people measure when it comes to brand tracking?
I'd love to, as I answer this in the chat, if people started commenting the metrics that they track along
Yeah, good idea.
at the moment. Would love to see that, whether we look at that now or revisit later. For this, it depends on company size and stage. So we found that for early stage companies, startups, maybe early stage scale ups, they tend to use a lot of metrics that maybe aren't focused on brand tracking specifically, which makes sense in terms of budget and whatnot. So they might be looking at website visits, branded search, maybe occasionally an aided awareness dip. And then as you get more mature, so I mean, the definition of scale up and growth stage companies is so vague, but towards growth, mid market, and beyond is where that measurement muscle is a bit more matured. So you're looking at your standard brand health funnel metrics. So aided awareness, consideration, preference. I saw someone through NPS, share of voice,
Yeah,
that type of thing. And what I mean in terms of common metrics, it is about right sizing it to the business stage. As said, if you're an early stage company, your probably most important metric is CAC to LTV, like understanding, do you have product market fit? Can you drive profitability after X number of sales? And going then allocating that towards brand tracking metrics, probably not wise.
yeah,
But really, regardless of what size of business is, are you appropriately measuring metrics that relate back to business outcomes? And if you aren't necessarily doing full brand funnel health data, are the proxies that you're using appropriately measuring brand?
Yeah.
Because we found in instances where you might use impressions as a metric, that there is really no correlation between impressions and brand awareness, and driving engagement doesn't necessarily translate to brand equity. And so I think they're the two important things, is to not look at marketing or brand metrics in isolation from business metrics, and then making sure that the metrics you are measuring are appropriately measuring the activity you want to achieve.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what's great is we've clearly got some really smart marketers in the room because you're talking about, I know for instance a mate of mine, Rob, who's part of the Birmingham community, has done lots of things with the theatre industry and understanding how people know about the particular organization that he's working with is like really interesting.
Yeah.
But that point on impressions, like I can imagine there are people going, oh well, put a social media post out and 1 million people have seen it, so we've increased our brand awareness. But you say it has very little, from your experience, that the impressions through to awareness isn't that a stronger correlation?
Yeah. So, I mean, all these metrics have their place in terms of what you're trying to achieve. But if you're thinking about long-term brand building, we ran a study with TikTok that looked at, and can always share the link after, where we looked at 147 different brands, all consistently spending on TikTok, um, varying degrees of brand awareness. And we looked at both their conversion metrics and their engagement metrics. So click-through rate, we looked at conversion rate, and then we looked at their funnel metrics. And one of the key findings was there was zero correlation between engagement metrics and brand awareness.
Huh.
So just because you drive engagement, so click through, doesn't mean that you're building familiarity with that consumer. But then when you looked at high awareness brands and you looked at their conversion rate, there was extremely differing efficiency on conversion rate. So high awareness brands just converted more respondents. And so when you think of dollar spend, you're just getting greater conversion the more awareness you have. And the numbers are pretty staggering. So it was, if you were a brand that was known by 4 out of 10 consumers, you had 43% more efficiency than a brand that was known by 3 out of 10 consumers. And
Wow.
it kept climbing. So without getting number drunk in a webinar, but if you were a brand of 60% awareness, you had 2.8 times the conversion rate of lower awareness brands. And so that's where it's not even just about making sure that you're right sizing the proxies. You actually can't tell as good of a story of all the excellent work you're doing if you're not appropriately measuring the right metric for that right outcome. And
Yeah.
impressions might be the phenomenal metric if engagement is what you're after. But if you're trying to tell a story of brand building and brand equity, then it's impressions in this example is not the one to go after.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I
Yeah.
guess it's that mental availability piece as well when somebody's in the market for a particular product or service. Like, does that brand come to mind? Uh,
Complete.
and if it doesn't, then there's work to be done. But I
Yeah.
think it's fascinating when I think about just on a personal level, when I think about using platforms like TikTok, it's algorithmically fed to me. Most of the content I see isn't from accounts that I follow. Even if I do choose to follow a brand, you never see any of that stuff because you're
Yeah.
just on the For You page anyway. So it becomes a hard platform. Maybe the platforms are different, but a hard one to actually build brand on because you're being fed. It's content led rather than brand led sort of stuff that's appearing.
Yeah. I think that's what that also raises, like a cool evolution of how brand is evolving, in the sense of every brand is omni-channel. There are certain channels that work better for brand, or a mass audience, mass scale, so out of home and TV. But you can absolutely still build brand on performance channels or social channels. And we've seen brands do phenomenal jobs of replicating great creative. So an example of that is Hexclad. Do people know the pan brand? They're a US pan brand. They have Gordon Ramsay as one of their
Okay.
celebrity endorsers and investors. And how they balance their creative is they know that on performance channels, um, their best creative is when they have Gordon Ramsay front and center. They can target people that love cooking, people that love Gordon. But then equally, they can scale up that reach and use him on out of home. They can use him in TV. And equally, Athletic Greens, they worked out that really focusing on ingredients from a product standpoint, that's what resonated with consumers regardless of channel. So whether it was out of home, whether it was TV, it was all about reinforcing this message of, 75 powerful ingredients packed in every scoop. And they would run that ad on YouTube, they would run that through TV. And so being able to get feedback from social channels of what is resonating from performance, but then equally using brand tracking or measurement to see what is the message that the category cares about, the people that are going to buy pans or are buying cookware,
Yeah.
what is their decision, and making sure that whether you're building brand, mass scale, out of home, TV, or you're still at the stage and you're building brand on socials, making sure that the message and the creative is what resonates
Yeah.
to
So
your
it's
audience.
not really performance versus brand. It's kind of one informing the other, would you say?
Yeah, I think this is the age-old debate of, is it performance, is it brand? Maybe I'm being naive that we're getting to the stage where that debate is ending and that there's just
Yeah.
so much data to show that they're complementary. And it's then identifying what channels are performance channels versus brand channels. How we think about this is essentially there's two groups of consumers in any market. So there's the people that are in market ready to buy right now, which we refer to as existing demand. They're the people that you go after, that you want to harvest, they want to purchase, so you want to convert them. And then they typically represent 5 to 15% of any category. And so let's go down the cookware category because we've already started with Hexclad. Anyone who's looking to buy cookware right now. And so you're targeting them with your direct response performance. And then you've got this future demand pool of people who are the consumers that aren't looking to buy right now, but will come into category in the future. And they represent the majority of your market. So that's 85 plus percent. And so you need to find a way to balance with marketing spend that you are absolutely capturing those people that are ready to buy now and converting them, but then you're still building affinity and a connection and rapport with the majority of your market so that when they do come into market, to your point then, James, like they think of you, they have a connection to you, and hey, I'm going to go and buy Athletic Greens.
Yeah.
And so I think it's stepping away from the versus conversation, and it is absolutely they go hand in hand. And when you are getting pushback or there is cost cutting, it's thinking, how do we think of our full marketing budget as two components and how do we adjust them both? Maybe it's not equally, but it's not about over investing on performance at the absence of brand. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
adjusting to what budget you have
Yeah.
available.
They complement. It's funny, we with the partners that we work with, we know the ones that, and it's why we don't do sort of, you know, a one webinar sponsorship thing,
Yeah.
because it's like, well, how many people are in market for, you know, a new CRM today who are on this webinar? Like, not that many, probably. So
Yeah.
you've got to be pretty lucky to convert, but actually over a period of time, you start to, you're building the trust, you're building the value, and it's when they're in market, it starts to happen.
Yeah. Should we try and break all webinar rules here and try and do an active game of engagement
Do
to
it. Let's
bring
do
people
it. Break the
alive?
rules.
Okay, here we go. So I mean, a way to show this is, okay, if anyone in the chat here who's looking to, is it a react button? Okay, a react button. Raise your hand, or sorry, put your thumbs up or react if you've purchased a phone in the last 2 weeks or you intend to buy a phone in the next 2 weeks. I have no idea how I'm gonna. Okay, we've got two,
Okay,
four,
two
five.
people.
Okay, we've got six. Okay.
We've got 440 people at the moment
Okay,
on the
nice.
call. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Need to,
And I reckon some of those people are just testing out the react
yeah,
button.
yeah, exactly. I think I might have accidentally clicked it a few times
Oh,
too.
okay.
Now raise your, or put your thumb up or react if you think that you'll buy a phone in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah,
There we
look at that. It's just a
brand
screen full of
building in a
thumbs.
webinar. Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what, when we have the brand versus performance debate, it's about how do we make sure that we are catering for both pools of people, because we know there's diminishing returns for trying to harvest the people, the 4 to 10 people out of the 400 in this webinar that are ready to buy a phone now. And it's about how do we make sure for the, let's call it 350 people that raise their thumb to essentially, yeah, the long and the short of it.
Yeah. And is that how you would, so if you were going into, so if we're moving on to the sort of communicating the value to internal stakeholders, I remember, like, I was thinking before this webinar, like, I remember, it's going to make me sound really old now. We used to spend most of our marketing budget on like industry. It was B2B company. Industry magazines was where, the boss wanted the money,
Yeah,
spend it.
yeah.
And I
Yeah.
wanted some budget for digital stuff and couldn't convince him. And now, like, it would be completely the other way around. If I wanted to put an advert in an industry magazine, it would be like, well, prove to me the value. Um, is is the sort of phone analogy the one that you would use to sort of frame the value of brand marketing to stakeholders
Yeah. So
for
I think
those that want like hard ROI kind of thing?
yeah, yeah, no, completely. I mean, there's 2 points you touched on. The first is leadership's view of, or their marketing literacy is critical. So understanding who you're speaking to, I think it's absolutely non-negotiable that you have to be able to speak in business outcomes, understand the language of CEOs and CFOs, but then also understand that leadership need to think about how you're also communicating back. What are their objectives? And so the great example of the last 12 months is Nike, where one of the most celebrated brand-led companies of all time, their leadership shifted. With that came a shift towards more performance-heavy mindset, amongst many other things, and they saw a real impact their performance over the course of the next. He was in. He was the CEO for 4 years or so, and we've seen across our metrics the erosion to their funnel. And now it's really about correcting that. So, I mean, if Nike can, from their leadership point, they can have challenges of understanding performance and brand and reallocating between the two, it can happen to any brand. And so I think that's the first piece is what does the leadership profile look like? Where are their focuses? And then as a marketing team, what we've found that's worked really well internally with our brands is how do you focus on 3 key levers, which are going to be the focus of any brand ever, which is how do I drive growth? How do I reduce cost of acquisition? And how do I build defensibility? And so 3 of the metrics that we like to think about is customer lifetime value. So how do you help to tell that story that once you've acquired a customer, that when you have stronger brand awareness, once you have that greater brand affinity, that having customers that are willing to spend more with you, whether that's repeat purchases or whether you have a price premium and pricing power within your category, that how powerful that can be. And then it's also thinking about how do you reduce the cost to acquire new customers over time. And that's coming back to that future demand and existing demand piece, that the more brand awareness that you build, the easier it becomes to convert those customers that come into market over time because they already know your brand, and your performance marketing engine has that conversion or that performance efficiency that I was
Yeah,
touching on. And I think it's pretty rare in any category that a consumer's going to buy a brand without some form of familiarity, especially to the examples you gave, whether that's changing bank or buying a car. You need to build familiarity over time and trust to
yeah,
drive conversion. Tesla's a great example of this, like brand erosion, losing trust. How does that impact their metrics? How are we seeing that impact their share price and at the moment? And the final piece on the cost side is when you have that brand awareness, when you have that loyalty, you're less reliant on economic levers like discounting or entering sales periods. So growth and retention are the two big pieces, or sorry, growth and customer acquisition. And then the final one, which is probably underrated, I would say, and is probably most important in today's day and age with the development of AI. I mean, we're 30 minutes up in. I've mentioned AI once, so surely that's a tick.
Well done. That's really good.
That's a
We should be
record.
proud of ourselves.
Yeah. But I think it's never been easier to get a product or service to market. But thinking about how brand builds defensibility around community and loyalty, that's really difficult to shortcut. And so,
Mm.
how do you frame the conversation of brand being a profit protection mechanism in the long term because you have that relationship with the customer? And in the day and age where competitors are spinning up at any time, you can't really shortcut that. So, the sooner you start doing it, the more of a relationship you can build with the customer, the more defensibility in the long term.
Yeah. And so I guess the hardest point for anybody wanting to make big changes, so say you've just got a new CMO role or a new marketing role and you've got this pressure uh to get immediate results
Yeah.
on on brand investment. I guess you just have to demonstrate that over time and watch it grow rather than and just explain that process that it's this stuff takes time, but it gets easier.
Yeah, completely. It's resetting expectations of what the purpose is. So expecting immediate results from brand is not really looking at the purpose of brand, the brand that we're taking a long-term play here. I mean, there was an article in Marketing Week earlier this month about Tetley really starting to invest in its brand platform to take market share, and that's fundamentally a long-term game. And so that's reframing the conversation to expect immediate results from brand building is not really looking at the purpose of brand. It's thinking long term.
Yeah,
But I think it's using now that we know that you can get short-term results, that you can actually see that brand is the platform for your performance engine to move and perform over time. So building brand now does directly start to act as a multiplier for your performance marketing engine.
yeah,
It's essentially unlocking a ceiling to your performance marketing engine. If you think of anyone who's ready to buy and market right now, that's capped. There's going to be diminishing returns. And so brand is just allowing for your performance engine to capture more people over time. There is one, like we think of performance as direct response, but then we don't think of brand building as delayed response marketing when it is really coming back to, hey, we've got to balance the both and we've got to measure our performance metrics in the immediate short term, but think about our brand building in the long term.
yeah. And I guess a final kind of question on that is, if you've got a situation where your budgets are being cut for whatever reason, there's lots of companies having a tough time out there at the moment. Do you have like a rule of let's say you're spending 40% on the acquisition stuff, you've got
Mm.
40% on brands, and you've got 20%, which is like your speculative, stuff that you're doing out there, and budgets are now going to be halved. Do you halve everything equally? Do you halve your performance, half your brand, and half your speculative stuff? Like what's the as rather than brand being a nice to have, and all of a sudden everything goes on to performance, like is it always the right thing to push back and go, no, you've got to continue to invest in brand, or can you have sort of periods where you dip out of investing in brand and just go straight for performance?
I wish I had this perfect budget calculator brain that I could just be like, these are the adjustments you make. But I think the conversation leads itself to what we've seen from a lot of consumer brands over the last 5 to 10 years is that, to your point of they would cut brand, go all in for whatever limited budget they have for the next financial year on performance. And what they're doing by doing that is really they're trading tomorrow's growth for a performance report in the next 12 months. And so, I mean, cutting budgets is never an easy exercise, but it's how do you rebalance your portfolio so you balance both the spend in the short term and the long term. And I mean, outside of just giving that general answer, some of the ways that we've seen this work quite well internally with a few of our customers is how do they think about efficiency of their direct response and thinking about the long and the short or existing demand versus future demand is that at a certain point, you get to that point of diminishing returns where if you're remarketing to a set of consumers, throwing more ads at them is not going to drive their propensity to buy. And so, are there ways within your performance budget or within that side of direct response that you can reallocate that spend? And actually, we find that there's a lot of efficiency from cutting down on whether it is remarketing and reallocating and testing out brand in another way. We've had a customer do that quite recently, and the overall performance of the business was pretty phenomenal. And so, yeah, it's not as easy as outside of the principled approach of, hey, if we believe that this is a brand and performance game, then we need to reduce budgets accordingly across both
Yeah.
allocations.
Yeah, I think
Also,
when we spoke before, you put it really brilliantly when you said like on performance marketing, if you've got an audience, a target audience, who is aware of you, there is a ceiling to how much you can spend before you get these diminishing returns, and the brand marketing piece is the bit that pushes that ceiling higher. And to
completely.
me, that was a real penny drop sort of way of explaining it. It was like, yeah, you're making the market bigger for yourself by making more people aware of you, and therefore your performance stuff will be will work better. So I think that
Yeah.
was
And the other point is just how do you capitalize on market share when, and again, easier said than done, but when brands are retreating and in tough economic environments where they're pulling back on brand, how do you either hold brand consistent so that you can still market share? And Tetley's a great example of a brand that's taking a really long-term view to start to eat into Yorkshire Tea's market leader position. They've got a lot of other parts to the puzzle in play, but then they're really capitalizing on brand in what is a pretty tough economic environment at the moment.
to be honest, I've written Tetley Tea now, so I think they make a great partner for us. The amount of tea that marketers drink, and if
Yeah,
they're investing in brand, then surely we're the right place to with the right audience. Um,
completely.
let's move on to the sort of measurement tactics tools, that sort of thing. Obviously, we're going to try and remove all bias. We think Tracksuit is brilliant, but I wondered whether you could talk through sort of the options that are available to folks out there.
Absolutely. So there's Tracksuit. And next
That's it.
question. No.
Okay, on to the next
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. I think this really does come back to the company stage. So early stage brands where depending on where that revenue ceiling is, it is about how do you take signals around product market fit? How do you think about branded search? How do you think about meta signals? Well, whichever channel that you're running analytics on, and really I don't think there's a focus towards how do I do full research or tracking, because your purpose is how do you prove product market fit?
Yeah.
When you start to get to more of a growth stage, then it is starting to think about how do I track brand so that I can understand how my perceptions are changing, how I'm moving within a category. And how we think about that is uh, idea that what gets measured gets managed. And so if you're not measuring brand, you're probably not managing or optimizing your brand spend. And so when you get to a certain marketing budget size where you are heavily investing in brand, you really want to be able to see, hey, what is working and what are the movements we're seeing within our category? And that's in combination with also understanding how a campaign's performing. So maybe running lift tests alongside that, always keeping an eye on unit economics, but really fundamentally understanding of those consumers within my market, what do they think about or what do they care about that drives them through a funnel? What proportion of those are aware of our brand but aren't converting to consideration? If I'm, let's go down, what else do marketers like outside of tea? Let's go
Clearly,
non-alcoholic beers.
there's a big conversation going on about which
Yeah,
tea I've stirred
yeah,
the hornet's nest here.
yeah.
Um,
But
yeah,
understanding that full funnel approach for your category. And then when you get to the really late stage, that's where you can, if you're Cadbury or whoever it might be, that's where really starting to invest in econometric modeling. So your marketing mix modeling to understand really clearly attribution. You're going to a level of depth, granularity, and cost that the vast majority of brands can't afford and probably don't need right now. But there does get to a certain point where there's dedicated companies looking at that side, and Tracksuit really exists because of those two spectrums. How do you make brand tracking more affordable so the vast majority of brands that don't need or can afford the sophistication of really high depth research, but can have an always on pulse of, is what I'm doing working from a brand perspective?
Yeah. And so if you are, let's take the two, uh, well, mid-market, mid-sized company and a sort of a smaller company, a startup. Like, what's the thing that you would, if you were going to spend any small budget you've got, or maybe things that you could do for free that you, if you were in a startup, what would be the things that you might track, or would you not bother tracking at that stage?
I think that in a startup, it's just purely looking at product market fit, CAC to LTV metrics, understanding how profitable I am on orders.
Yeah,
Branded search really helpful as well. I think those directionally give you the steer on momentum and feasibility. And then when you get to the certain size, it's starting to introduce brand health metrics like aided awareness consideration. Also thinking about if you're at relatively low awareness, then there's probably not a need to focus on bottom of funnel usage or preference, just because your game or the focus there is how do you build top of funnel awareness.
yeah,
And how you can also really bring this to life is then looking at controlled experiments. So say you are I'll just use Lucky Saint, where you might focus in Greater London, for instance. How do you compare your conversion performance metrics where in Greater London, where you have great awareness versus another region where maybe you have lower awareness, as an example? And so that's where you can really start to tell the story of brand can help you to tell a story of, hey, this is really starting to drive our conversion in the regions where we have higher awareness. Let's keep building brand across the UK, and because we know that that will help drive our performance in those regions as well. And obviously, it's all dependent on physical availability as well within regions if you're a physical good. But yeah, that's how we would typically think about it.
yeah. That's really interesting. I'd never really thought about uh, taking like different regions as a benchmark. But I think it's a really good way to demonstrate brand value is to say, well, in the Midlands, we're drinking what tea are we drinking in the Midlands? I'll let the community tell me that because clearly I got it wrong. And then, up in Yorkshire, are we all drinking Yorkshire tea, or are people up there drinking Tetleys? Like, but like actually running those experiments to say, well, we've invested in, out of home advertising in Yorkshire for Tetley's tea. Yeah, look, I told you I'd stir the hornet's
Yeah, there
nest.
you go.
Yorkshire and the Midlands
Kicking
down.
off.
So here we go, kicking off.
Yeah.
And then sort of showing the impact that's had.
Yeah.
I think that's super interesting. Um, if you were to have some like KPIs to sort of to start, like if there was like your top three KPIs that you measure, would it go like, well, what would you go back to?
Top three KPIs, ignoring
Because there's a million and one things you can measure, right?
completely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of our founding USPs is about making it accessible. So just
Yeah,
making it really clear. So it would have to be aided awareness, depending on ignoring brand size, brand perceptions, understanding what drives a category. And then finally, I think it's connecting it back to long-term revenue growth. And I mean, there's a bunch of examples from our customers about how they've run brand, like long-term investment on brand to see how has that translated into next year's revenue, next year's margins. And so I think always being able to bring that story of brand measurement back to a business outcome, back to one of those three, whether it's growth, retention, customer acquisition, or defensibility is really important.
yeah, no, that's great. Have you got? I mean, we talked sort of briefly about some examples, and I know we were gonna touch on the sort of founder-led stuff, but have you got examples where of customers that maybe Tracksuit have worked with over time, where you've seen them really winning when it comes to Tetley's are obviously on this journey. I don't know why I keep going back to tea, but
Yeah,
but
yeah,
maybe haven't sort of reaped the rewards yet. Like, are there brands where you've seen that really successfully? I know we've put quite a few examples of of stories and stuff into our newsletter that
Mm.
you've kindly provided for us. But what are the ones that sort of stand out for you?
Yeah, I mean, to put the tea debate to bed, there is a report called the Brand Map that everyone could check out to see who is the winners
Oh,
between
let's just. Oh,
different
there we
regions.
go. So I
The
think
one
somebody's already
link.
done it. Brand Map report. Well
Oh,
done,
really? There
sir.
you go. I think one of the coolest examples we have is with a brand in the US called the RealReal. And so they're a luxury marketplace. And they were going through last year, they were going through essentially efficiencies across the business. How do you drive profitability? And so, as part of that, they were starting to pull back spend. And what they did is they reallocated some of their influencer spend towards brand. And one of the epic campaigns they ran is so they spun up a pop-up store in Canal Street in New York, which is the home of counterfeit luxury fashion. And the campaign was like on the front window, it said, "Ask yourself what's real." Essentially, in the store was all this counterfeit goods, and it really blew up on socials. Authenticators came into the store, couldn't tell what was real, what was not,
Wow.
and it was their first like dipping their toe into the world of how can brand drive long-term growth. And this is where it's the cool story of actually you do get immediate short-term signals as well. So I mean, over the course of the next 12 months, awareness grew 9%. Their category only grew 2%. So they were well ahead of their category. Revenue jumped 15 mil in the course of the next quarter and on comparable and last results. Sorry, quarter on quarter results.
Right.
And so this is just where they had initially looked at hey, brand might be viewed as a cost center, but actually what they really started to see was that brand was that platform that allowed them to grow without any changing any media spend whilst doing that experiment. And so that's just one where the internal perception around brand building really shifted to being, hey, this is a growth accelerator for us in the long term within our category. Um, Doing epic campaigns can drive such phenomenal reach. And even just the immediate signals of sales conversations, how did that start to people to be more receptive to the brand? Um, and so, yeah, that's one of the brands that has
Yeah, I
really
love that.
started to lean into.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah,
I'm conscious like time is whipping away, and we've got 22 open questions here. I was going to talk about maybe we just very quickly touch on the sort of founder-led businesses. So yesterday when we had a quick catch up, we were talking about how like my perception of Tesla has gone from sort of fairly neutral about the car to I probably wouldn't buy one now just because it's associated with Musk. And
yeah,
and yet you've got somebody like Zuckerberg, who has sort of been very intentional about how he's tried to, whether you like it or not, has tried to change his perception of, gone from kind of nerdy computer guy to like MMA fighting,
yeah.
cool guy with a chain. Like, what's the importance there when it comes to founder-led stuff?
Oof. Yeah, it is. That is a tough question with those two. Um, Short answers probably don't hire Musk there into a brand role, but no, I think the it's an interesting case study of controlling for founder personal brands and how it can be done well and how it can done really poorly. And example being of like you can have really inspirational founders, like whether that's a Steve Jobs, whether that's a Richard Branson, that can really drive your brand or your and perceptions around your brand in the right direction versus um, one that can completely erode your brand. And we've seen that translate into their funnel metrics over the last 12 months. So that
Interesting.
piece around trust and how I think from the last time I checked it, it was around 15% of respondents in the car category trusted Tesla as a brand versus it was 59% or 60% for Toyota. And for a purchase that is so low velocity, you're not really buying cars too regularly or entering the market, having founders or spokespeople that speak to the attributes that drive decisions in your category, calling back on the RealReal, like their brand campaigns was all around driving how does authenticity and authentication get brought to the forefront so that you trust when you buy a bag that it's going to be real. It's same for what Tesla's going through right now
Yeah.
around trust and how quickly you can erode that with not the right spokesperson. So it's a tough game to be playing.
And so is that something marketers, I think about like the marketing meetup, most people will know Joe,
Yeah.
kind of like, you know, he's a really important part of our story.
Yeah.
If Joe goes rogue, which I'm hoping he won't, like do brands can brands bring in the founder kind of sub brand as part of their tracking?
Yeah, I mean, how we would look at that as an example is, yeah, how is being founder led? How well does that impact your brand perceptions? But then I think part of it is also what drives a decision. So coming back to your point of some of the KPIs that is important to measure are what are the attributes that people actually care about within your category? So if you're going really deep on a founder-led story and no one in the category that really doesn't drive conversion or consideration or preference, you're probably focusing on the wrong things, or maybe it's less important. So it is absolutely something to measure, but it's understanding how does that founder drive brand attributes that matter to your category.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
no,
so
that's great.
maybe it's about bringing you to the forefront, James. Who knows?
I don't know, but like, there's a lot of story, a lot of chat here about Joe going rogue. Joe Rogueman is
You
gonna
go.
is the next one.
That's
Let's
outstanding.
take some questions and try and rattle through a few. We've got someone from an anonymous attendee here saying, if you work in a B2B industry where access to panels or data around your audience is limited, is there a good way to gather the right data around awareness and consideration cost effectively?
It is a really good question. B2B is challenging for that incidence rate of buyers. We found a few good providers that can be helpful around B2B panels. Cost is challenging. We're seeing an emergence of like synthetic data trying to help to solve for B2B buyers because of that cost piece. Tracksuit focuses on consumer, so I'm not too familiar with B2B panels, unfortunately. Um, but yeah, it might be about thinking about other metrics
Yeah.
instead.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay. So Richard has asked, how do you make sure you're infusing brand across every touch point, which is a big question, without getting burnt out when you're a small team?
That is a really good question. I think two things to this is fundamentally, I had this great conversation the other day around everyone thinks that they can contribute to the marketing conversation, but actually marketers are the experts. And so you might get someone from finance chiming in and be like, that creative isn't great. What about if you did this for some reason, as opposed to a marketer jumping in and being like, that P&L looks off. And so I think it's about balancing the leadership conversation, that the responsibility of how you show up for your brand sits across every function.
Yeah.
The direction that is driven from the marketing team is owned and run by the marketing team. They are the experts around how you drive brand. So I think that you lean on leadership to set the culture of brand touches not just the marketing team, but every function in the business.
Yeah, because I guess even that, accountancy team, the way they behave, the story they're telling is has to be consistent. And yeah, it's not necessarily the role of marketing to do that, but maybe marketing can support in making sure they understand that they are, that everybody is marketing kind of thing,
Completely.
without chiming in on the the creative. Uh,
Yeah.
so I mentioned Rob earlier, and he's asked a question.
Yeah.
So he says, how do marketers convince the C-suite to invest? Most CEOs readily talk about brands they love, and it's never just the logo. Yet they often fool themselves that they are long-termists by resisting decent brand funding. What stops them? Impatience, lack of courage, their own short-term performance measurement, controlling CFO? Lots of questions there.
It probably varies a lot. I think there's some really telling public examples of brands that have made it the shift away from brand building and how that's led to the detriment of their growth. So to your point of one can be that one of the most frustrating conversations that can happen is, oh, but I love this brand and they do it well. And so knowing that every category is different, the principles don't change. But Nike, as an example, is what, like a phenomenal case study about how steering away from the foundation of building great brands from the long and the short of how can that impact immediate results. I think it's also finding a way to bring brand metrics, link it back to business outcomes and find its way into the boardroom and how people communicate internally. And so that's not a change that can happen overnight, but it's about what is the business outcome trying to achieve, and then how do you align marketing's goals around those outcomes, and not just talk about outputs like we ran X number of campaigns, but you're talking about outcomes. So coming back to the RealReal, when they think about that investment and that movement from just performance to brand, how that directly related itself back to awareness uplift, positive sentiment jumped 73%, and then equally revenue and margin in the corresponding year really improved.
Yeah. And
So
I
I
think
think,
that's quite often the piece that's maybe missing is as marketers we can talk about the marketing side, but it's making sure that we get all the way to the business metrics at the end of it that sort of justifies all the stuff you've been talking about.
completely.
Um, and
And
it's not
hopefully,
always go on, sorry.
yeah, and I was going to say, hopefully controlled experimentation where you can start to tell the story of, hey, how we run our ads in one region where we have better awareness versus another helps to slowly chip away at the story over time, because it might be hard to jump from 0 to 100 in terms of how they dramatically change the brand allocation, but starting to chip away with different tests and metrics.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. No, that's great. Um, the next most upvoted one is from Juliet, and she says you mentioned that you need to relate it back to business metrics. Could you give some examples of metrics and how they might relate back to the business goals? Is it just so? I think one of the things that I've seen people do in the past is they'll be like, "Oh, like revenue's gone up because of this campaign," but actually they've kind of missed the point that
Yeah.
net profits are down
Yep.
because they've for whatever reason. What sort of things would you say are important to measure there?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. The first is customer acquisition. So understanding, like, that's absolutely a metric that will flow through to board level. What is the cost to acquire a customer? And how do you start to relate that story between how is brand awareness, brand consideration growing over time, and how is that impacting the cost to acquire new customers? So I think that's a starting point around how do you really start to tell the stories at a unit economic basis that's becoming easier or that's improving, let alone also just focusing on growth, James, because to your point, you can grow revenue, but if it's not flowing through to the bottom line, that gets really challenging as a story to tell. But I think that those telling those stories hand in hand are really important. And brand attribution is an imperfect science around what campaign, what channel is really starting to move or drive the needle. And it's about really building a culture of consistency and understanding that hey, it's the accumulation of multiple touch points, multiple campaigns, multiple activity that is really driving growth. And so, how, especially for our scale up brands where maybe they can't be running lots of lift tests, how they tell that story is how do I compare my brand funnel metrics versus my category versus my competitors? Because if my awareness has grown 2% and I can see that competitors in the category have dipped 4%, that's a phenomenal outcome. And so it's also being able to set the context for leadership to show, hey, what are the leading indicators? What are the great signals of what's coming? Because we know that as brand awareness and brand metrics increase over time, that's a signal that future sales will improve.
Yeah, no, that's great. We've probably got time for one more. So Alex Tuck has put, how do you sell in brand to growth stage businesses that are just focused on short-term marketing sales efforts and do not see the value? I mean, I think we've probably kind of covered that one earlier on, but have you got any more thoughts on that?
I think the quick take on that is that brand is that foundation for their performance engine to continue to be efficient in the future. So that if they are performance at the heart, they're a performance team, they will rely on building future demand with customers for next year's performance machine to keep rolling really quickly. Happy to share that report as well on the TikTok awareness advantage study, but I think that's what resonates um, with performance teams, that ultimately you're chasing attention, and how do you get the most bang for your buck from that attention. And so finding the right channel, spending the right amount of money, but then also having consumers that have familiarity is the critical part.
Yeah, that'd be great. And if you could share that report, then we'll put it in the we'll put it in the follow-up email. Is there anywhere that you obviously we put our in our Friday email, Tracksuit put an insert, put facts and case studies and stuff into our
Mm.
Friday email. They're really, really interesting. Is there any other resources that you tend to gravitate towards when it comes to this? Other than Tracksuit, are there other things that you tend to follow and keep an eye on?
Um, oh, there's lots, to be honest. I think the IPA just continually push out phenomenal research, especially in the current environment. System One do great work around creative consistency last year. So I tend to and walk the World Advertising Research Center around what media is winning in certain years and how where spend is going. I think those three resources have been really, yeah, tend to keep leaning back onto those.
Yeah, that's wicked. Okay, well, we'll any resources that you think are going to be helpful, let's get them sent over, and we'll pop them in the follow-up email. But I'm massively appreciative of your time, Dan. And we didn't even mention that a lot of people will have signed up for the Matt Herbert
Oh
uh,
yeah, well played,
webinar.
Chris. Sorry,
Uh,
everyone.
but we got the better version. We got Dan.
Yeah.
Dan's the one with all the knowledge. He's the one really running the show. So
Well, when are Joe and Matt doing their webinar? I feel
yeah,
like
well,
well,
exactly.
you're sorted.
Joe and Matt are obviously on holiday. James
Yeah.
and Dan take over. I think it's much better. But no, really appreciate you coming on today. Our next webinar is going to be on the 13th of May. In fact, I've got the little link here that I can put in the chat, which I think you will like. We have got it with the co-founders of Better Briefs, and they're going to be talking about how to have impactful ideas. So yeah, join us on the 13th. Dan, what a legend. Thank you so much. I hope you get to have some sunshine, and I hope the rest of you go and have a little break now, a little walk in the sun. I've got a Labrador that is moaning at me. I've been trying to keep her quiet throughout the whole webinar, but it's been wonderful seeing so many people in the chat, and we'll see you again very soon. So thanks again, Dan, and
Thanks, James. Thanks,
speak to you
everyone.
soon, folks. All right, take care.
See you.
Cheers. Bye.